"You're just an employee here, not the heir," my father smirked, pushing me out of the executive meeting. My brother grinned triumphantly. Then crisis hit, stocks plummeted 40%. They called me begging for help. I just smiled and said, "Not my company anymore." I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are. I'd love it if you could share in the comments which city or country you're watching from and what time it is there. Now let's begin our story together. The name on the faded sign still read Miller & Son Foods, a testament to a legacy I once believed was mine to carry. Now looking back, it feels more like a monument to my own youthful naivety. Our company, a regional gourmet food producer known for its artisanal jams and sauces, wasn't always the quiet success story it had become under my reluctant stewardship. A decade ago, it was a sinking ship and I was the son who'd abandoned his own voyage to try and keep it afloat. I can still picture my parents, Arthur and Eleanor Miller, as they were back then. It was late August, the kind of stifling East Coast summer evening where the air itself feels heavy with unshed rain. I'd just flown in from California, my acceptance letter to a dream engineering job in Silicon Valley, practically burning a hole in my pocket. I found them in the old office, a cramped space that always smelled faintly of my father's pipe tobacco, stale coffee, and a new sharper scent I'd later identify as pure anxiety. The overhead fluorescent light hummed a dreary tune, casting sallow shadows on their faces. My father, usually so upright and assured, was slumped in his worn leather chair, staring at a stack of invoices as if they were death warrants. My mother sat beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, but even her customary optimism seemed to have evaporated, leaving behind a residue of quiet despair. The weight of their fear felt like a physical presence in the room, pressing down on me, suffocating. "Liam, thank God you're here," my mother had whispered, her voice thin. My father just grunted, not looking up. That offer letter in my bag, so crisp and promising, suddenly felt like a betrayal to even hold. Knowing their life's work, my grandfather's legacy was crumbling. They didn't ask, not directly. They didn't have to. Their exhaustion, the way their eyes avoided mine, it was an unspoken plea. So I made a choice. I traded the California sun and the cutting edge of technology for the familiar scent of simmering fruit and spices, for the clatter of bottling lines and the endless, thankless task of resurrection. The first few years were brutal. I practically lived at the factory, a sprawling old brick building by the river. The smell of spices, yeast, and packaging cardboard became my second skin. I pored over books on modern food production, supply chain management, marketing, anything to give us an edge. I redesigned outdated production lines, sourced higher quality local ingredients, and developed a new organic range that slowly, painstakingly began to catch on. I remember the thrill of our first big order for that organic line, my hands trembling slightly as I signed the contract. It felt like the first gasp of air after being underwater for too long. My parents were pleased, of course, in their reserved way. "Good work, son," my father would say, a brief pat on my shoulder before retreating back to his office, the one that was still grander than mine under my effective leadership though. Arthur Miller always retained the title of CEO. The company grew. We won regional awards. Our products featured in gourmet magazines and profits climbed steadily. I was the engine, the innovator, the one who stayed late and came in early, yet the recognition always felt filtered. At industry events, my father would accept accolades with a magnanimous air, occasionally gesturing towards me with a vague, "And my son, Liam, helps out as if I were a summer intern." My mother, Eleanor, had a softer touch, but her comments often carried a subtle barb. "Liam, you work so terribly hard, dear." She'd sigh, tracing the rim of her wineglass at family dinners. "It's a shame you don't have more time for yourself to start a family of your own." It always came with a gentle, almost pitying smile, a hint that my role, however crucial, was temporary, a placeholder until something or someone more permanent came along. That someone, I suppose, was always meant to be Ethan, my younger brother, the prodigal son. While I was wrestling with payroll and negotiating with suppliers, Ethan was flitting between business ideas abroad, each one more grandiose and ill-fated than the last. His calls always had the same breezy, confident tone, whether he was launching a crypto startup in Bali or consulting for a high-fashion brand in Milan. The only constant was the inevitable request for a substantial wire transfer at the end of the call, a request my parents always fulfilled with a sigh and a lecture about responsibility that never seemed to stick. I told myself their old-fashioned ways, their blatant favoritism were just, well, old-fashioned. That performance and loyalty, my decade of turning water into wine for them, would ultimately speak louder than birth order. I was wrong. Ethan returned to the US about a year ago, supposedly ready to settle down and contribute. He was in his early 30s, but carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who'd never truly faced consequences. My father, beaming, Gave him the title Director of Strategic Development, a role so vague it was meaningless, complete with a newly refurbished corner office larger than mine. Naturally, that mostly gathered dust. The expensive, sharp scent of Ethan's cologne seemed to clash with the honest, earthy smells of the factory floor whenever he deigned to visit. I tried to onboard him to explain the intricacies of our operations, the relationships I'd painstakingly built with our suppliers and distributors. He'd scroll through his phone during my presentations on supply chain logistics, his brow furrowed in feigned concentration, then ask a completely irrelevant question about the company car policy or the best restaurants for a client lunch he had no intention of attending. When confronted with details or potential problems, he'd offer his signature dismissive handwave. Yeah, I get it, bro. Not rocket science. My parents began to openly champion him. Arthur started including Ethan in high-level meetings. Liam used to lead off in deferring to Ethan's ill-informed opinions. Let's hear what Ethan thinks. He has fresh eyes. My father would say, a new warmth in his voice that I hadn't heard directed at me in years. It was like watching a shadow eclipse, the sun slowly at first, then all at once. My unease grew, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. I tried to talk to my mother, hoping for an ally or at least some understanding. Her response was a masterpiece of gentle gaslighting. "Oh, Liam, don't be so sensitive," she'd said, her voice laced with that familiar, brittle sweetness. "Your father just wants Ethan to feel involved, to learn the ropes. Family has to support family, you know. He's your brother." The implication was clear. My feelings, my contributions were secondary to Ethan's need to feel involved. The foundation of betrayal was being laid, brick by insidious brick, and I was too steeped in filial duty to see the true design. The following months were a masterclass in watching a slowly sinking ship accelerate its descent, all while the captain and his favored son waved cheerfully from the helm. Ethan, emboldened by our parents' unwavering support, began to inject his strategic development into every facet of the business. His ideas were usually flashy, utterly impractical, and often threatened the very quality and reputation I'd spent a decade building. He suggested we switch to cheaper, imported fruit purees instead of our locally sourced whole fruits to optimize profit margins. He wanted to rebrand our classic, beloved label with something edgy and modern that looked like a bad imitation of a craft beer logo. Each suggestion was a small stab to my professional pride. I found myself constantly running damage control. I'd spend hours after Ethan's brainstorming sessions, smoothing ruffled feathers with our long-term suppliers who were understandably insulted by his brash attempts to renegotiate established contracts. I discreetly shelved his more outlandish marketing proposals, hoping he'd forget about them. It felt like I was patching holes in a ship while the captain's son was busy drilling new ones, cheered on by the captain himself. My days became a draining cycle of vigilance and quiet correction, all performed with a smile that felt increasingly like a grimace. The stress began to take its toll. Sleep became a luxury, often interrupted by jolting anxieties about what new disaster I'd find at work the next day. A persistent tightness began to grip my chest as if someone had wrapped barbed wire around my lungs, squeezing a little tighter with each fresh indignity. I was isolated. My old college friends were miles away, deep in their own careers. And within the company, while many of the long-term staff knew what was happening, they were powerless. Maria Rodriguez, our head of operations, a sharp, no-nonsense woman I'd mentored and who had become a trusted colleague, would often catch my eye after a particularly absurd suggestion from Ethan in a production meeting. Her expression, a mixture of sympathy and frustration, was a small, silent acknowledgement that I wasn't crazy. "Mr. Liam," she said to me once, her voice low as we stood by the loading docks, the scent of diesel fumes mixing with the sweet aroma of cooked berries. "This isn't right. What they're doing to you, to the company, it's just not right." Her validation was a small comfort, but it didn't change the trajectory. I tried confronting my father directly, choosing a moment when he seemed relatively calm, reviewing sales reports in his office. I laid out my concerns, not with anger, but with facts. Ethan's lack of experience, the potential damage to our brand, the dip in morale among staff who saw the blatant unfairness. Arthur listened, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he adjusted his tie, that signature self-important gesture he always made before delivering what he considered an unassailable pronouncement. "Ethan is your brother, Liam, and he's my son," he said, his voice deceptively mild. "He'll learn. He has a good head on his shoulders. You were young once too. Don't forget." The false equivalent stung. A deliberate refusal to acknowledge my 10 years of proven success versus Ethan's lifetime of failures. He was telling me in no uncertain terms that blood, or rather his preferred bloodline, trumped everything. The final straw, the one that snapped my already frayed patience, involved a crucial new contract with a high-end national grocery chain. I'd been cultivating this relationship for months, carefully tailoring our proposal, hosting their representatives, showcasing the quality and integrity of Miller & Son Foods. It was on the verge of being signed, a deal that would significantly expand our reach. Then one Monday morning, my father announced that Ethan would be taking the lead on closing the deal to give him executive experience. Ethan, who barely knew the grocery chain's name, let alone the nuances of the contract. He swaggered into the final negotiation meeting radiating an unearned confidence that quickly curdled into cluelessness when faced with specific questions from their seasoned procurement team. He fumbled, he blustered, he made promises we couldn't keep. The deal predictably fell through. The grocery chain politely informed us they'd be re-evaluating their options. That evening, I demanded a family meeting. The four of us sat in the formal living room of my parents' house, a room rarely used, filled with antique furniture and an air of suffocating propriety. The silence crackled. I laid it all out, my decade of sacrifice, my quantifiable achievements, Ethan's consistent blunders, the latest fiasco with the grocery contract, the tangible risk to the business I had rebuilt. I spoke with a passion born of desperation and a deep aching sense of injustice. When I finished, a heavy silence descended. Then my father spoke, his voice cold, devoid of any warmth. The business, Liam, will pass to the firstborn son. That is the tradition. That is how it will be. He paused, his gaze unwavering. You've done a good job, a very good job as a placeholder. But Ethan is the future of Miller & Son. Placeholder. The word hung in the air, an epitaph for a decade of my life. My mother reached out, her fingers brushing my arm. It's just how things are, dear, she murmured. Her eyes filled with a sorrow that felt more for herself than for me. We need to ensure Ethan is settled. Then came the final brutal blow. My father, with Ethan smirking beside him, proposed that my existing shares in the company, shares I had earned through sweat equity agreements when the company was worthless, be significantly diluted. The majority would be reallocated to Ethan to reflect his upcoming leadership role. My shares, the ones I earned rebuilding this company from its ashes, the ones that represented the only tangible acknowledgement of my worth, my breath caught in my throat. The room with its heavy drapes and portraits of stern-faced ancestors suddenly felt foreign, the walls closing in. Every family photo on the mantelpiece seemed like an accusation. This, I realized with a sickening clarity, was my bottom moment. The carefully constructed illusion of family loyalty had shattered, leaving only the jagged, ugly reality of their betrayal. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced replaying their words, their cold expressions. Placeholder. The word echoed a cruel taunt in a daze of grief and anger. I drove to my parents' house. The next morning, I had to retrieve some personal effects, old files and sentimental items I'd stored in a forgotten wooden cabinet in my father's study, a space I used to do my homework in as a boy, dreaming of a future I thought we'd share. As I sorted through dusty boxes, my fingers brushed against a set of old hardbound financial ledgers and a bundle of letters tied with faded string tucked away at the very back. They predated my involvement with the company by several years. Curiosity, or perhaps a desperate need for some explanation, any explanation for their current cruelty, made me open them. What I found made the blood freeze in my veins. The executive meeting I'd called was scheduled for the following day. My intention had been to formally protest the share dilution, to make one last stand for my position, my work. Now armed with the sickening knowledge from those ledgers, the meeting felt like a stage for a preordained execution. I walked into the boardroom, the long mahogany table gleaming under the recessed lights. My father sat at its head, Ethan preening in the chair beside him, my old chair. Other board members, mostly old family friends or passive investors, looked on with varying degrees of discomfort. I began to speak, my voice trembling slightly despite my resolve. I spoke of my contributions of the company's growth. Before I could even get to the proposed share dilution, my father cut me off, his voice like a whip crack. Liam, we appreciate your input. He practically spat the word. Then came the smirk I would never forget, a condescending, cruel twist of his lips. But your role here has been thoroughly discussed. You're an employee, Liam. A valued one, perhaps, but just an employee, not the heir. He made a small dismissive gesture towards the door with his chin. This meeting is for key stakeholders. My father then physically rose and placed a hand on my shoulder, not gently, but with a firm pressure, pushing me towards the exit. Perhaps you can have HR draft your updated employment terms. Ethan didn't even try to hide his grin. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. I was being physically, humiliatingly pushed out of the company I had saved from a meeting I had called. The other board members stared at their notes at the table anywhere, but at me. The click of the door as it closed behind me sounded like a gunshot in the sudden silence of the hallway. My chest tightened, the barbed wire constricting until I could barely breathe. Humiliation burned my cheeks. Reeling, I stumbled back to my small office. The one they hadn't bothered to upgrade. My hands were trembling so hard I could barely grip the doorknob. I had to clear out my personal belongings. As I numbly packed a box, my eyes fell again on the old ledgers and letters I'd brought from my parents' study. Now sitting on my desk, like harbingers of doom with a surge of desperate anger, I spread them out. The story they told was far uglier than I could have imagined. It wasn't just mismanagement that had nearly bankrupted Miller & Son a decade ago. My father, Arthur Miller, had made a series of incredibly reckless, almost fraudulent investments with company funds chasing high-risk ventures that had all spectacularly failed. There were letters from furious creditors, thinly veiled threats of legal action. My mother, Eleanor, had clearly been complicit. Her elegant script on notes detailing how to placate certain individuals, how to reallocate funds to cover immediate shortfalls. They hadn't just been incompetent. They'd been on the verge of actual ruin, facing not just financial collapse, but profound personal and legal disgrace. My intervention, my tireless work hadn't just saved their business. I'd unknowingly saved them from a scandal that would have destroyed their reputation and quite possibly landed my father in court. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Their current actions, their callous dismissal of me, their anointing of Ethan, it wasn't just about some archaic notion of primogeniture. It was about control. It was about ensuring their carefully buried past stayed buried. I, with my competence and my intimate knowledge of the company's finances, had become a threat. Ethan, malleable and ignorant, was safe. They didn't see me as a son. They saw me as a tool, first for salvation, then as a risk to be neutralized. The betrayal was absolute, a chasm that could never be bridged. A cold hard anger began to displace the shock. Crystallizing into a sharp unyielding resolve, I picked up my phone and dialed the number of Sarah Chun, my oldest college friend, now one of the sharpest corporate lawyers in the city. "Sarah," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "I think I need your help. It's about my family." The weeks following my ousting from Miller & Son Foods were a blur of legal consultations with Sarah and a painful, but necessary emotional disentanglement. I formally resigned my letter brief and professional, citing irreconcilable differences in strategic direction. It sent a ripple of unease through the company. I heard later, Maria Rodriguez called me, her voice heavy with dismay and a quiet anger on my behalf. "They're fools, Mr. Liam," she said. "Absolute fools. This place won't be the same without you." Her words were a small solace in a sea of bitterness. I focused on myself. For the first time in over a decade, I wasn't living and breathing Miller & Son. I started consulting for a few smaller food startups, sharing the expertise I'd hard-earned. The work was engaging and it felt good to be valued for my skills without the suffocating weight of family obligation. I reconnected with old friends. I even, after some initial hesitation, reached out to my Uncle David, my mother's younger brother. He and my parents had been estranged for years. A polite, but distinct coolness had always existed between him and Arthur. I'd never fully understood why, but now pieces were starting to click into place. Uncle David, a retired architect with a calm demeanor and surprisingly astute eyes, listened to my story over coffee in his sunlit downtown apartment filled with books and blueprints. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "Liam," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "your parents, particularly Arthur, always did have a peculiar way of valuing things, mostly themselves and the appearance of success. I learned that the hard way, a long time ago." He didn't elaborate on his own experiences, but the quiet empathy in his eyes spoke volumes. His unexpected validation was a balm to my wounded spirit, a quiet confirmation that I wasn't the one who was broken. About 6 months after my departure, the news began to filter through, first as whispers in the industry, then as more concrete reports. Miller & Son Foods was in trouble, deep trouble. Ethan, now fully at the helm with our father's blessing, was apparently steering the ship directly onto the rocks. His strategic developments were proving disastrous. He'd launched a bizarre new line of artisanal ketchup in flavors like smoked paprika and ghost pepper and lavender and honey based on a fleeting trend he'd seen on some influencer's social media feed. The packaging was garish, the product itself reportedly unpalatable. It bombed spectacularly, leading to massive write-offs of unsold inventory and damaging recalls when a batch was found to have quality control issues. He'd alienated one of our key distributors with his arrogance and ignored repeated warnings from experienced staff like Maria, who I heard was looking for other opportunities. Ethan's signature dismissive hand wave, once a symbol of his casual arrogance, was now probably a gesture of panicked incompetence, though I only saw it replayed in my mind's eye. Then came the headline in the regional business journal. Miller & Son stocks plummet 40% amid product failures and leadership concerns. Creditors were circling. National media outlets, smelling blood, picked up the story of the failing historic family business and the golden boy who was running it into the ground. The call started on a Tuesday morning. First, my mother, her voice tight with unshed tears, a stark contrast to her usual smooth composure. "Liam, darling, it's your father. The company, oh, Liam. It's a terrible mess." Then my father himself, his usually booming voice reduced to a strained rasp, "Liam's son. We might have been hasty. Ethan as well, he's young. The company needs a steady hand, your hand." And finally, Ethan, his bravado, utterly gone, replaced by a whining desperation, "Bro. You gotta help us. This is insane. It's all falling apart. They're blaming me, but it's not all my fault. They wanted me to meet." I agreed. Not at the office, not at their home, but at a neutral, impersonal coffee shop downtown. A place with no memories, no ghosts. They were already there when I arrived, huddled together at a small table in the corner, looking older, smaller, and utterly defeated. Arthur's usually immaculate suit was rumpled. Eleanor's eyes were red-rimmed. Ethan just stared into his untouched latte, looking like a chasing schoolboy. The contrast to their smug confidence just 6 months prior was almost shocking. They pleaded. They bargained. They attempted to wield the familiar weapon of guilt. "Think of the family legacy, Liam." Arthur implored, his hand instinctively going to his tie, but the gesture once so authoritative now looked pathetic, a nervous tic. "Your grandfather built this company from nothing. You can't let it die." Eleanor tried a softer approach, her voice trembling. "We made a mistake, Liam. Terrible mistake. We see that now. We were just trying to do what we thought was best for Ethan, to give him a chance." I let them speak, listening with a calmness that surprised even myself. The old anger, the raw pain had receded, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. When they finally wound down their arguments exhausted, I leaned forward slightly. "You talk about legacy, Dad," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying in the hushed space they had created around our table. "But what legacy is that? The one built on my 10 years of work, or the one built on your secrets?" Their faces froze. Arthur's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the real reason you were so desperate to push me aside," I continued, holding their gazes. "It wasn't just about Ethan being the firstborn, was it? It was about those old ledgers, Dad, the ones from before I came back, the ones detailing your creative investments, the ones that nearly landed you in court." The blood drained from Arthur's face. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Ethan just looked bewildered, glancing between me and his parents. "I didn't just save a failing business. I told them the words precise, deliberate. I saved you from ruin, from disgrace, and this is how you repaid me. You called me a placeholder. You pushed me out because you were afraid I knew too much, or that I'd eventually find out. You preferred an incompetent son you could control over one who actually knew how to run the company, because he wouldn't threaten your secrets." A heavy silence fell. The clatter of cups and the low of conversation from the rest of the coffee shop seemed a world away. "We need you, son," Arthur finally whispered, his voice hoarse. "Only you can fix this. Name your price, anything." I looked at them, at the 3 people who had constituted my entire world for so long, who had shaped me and ultimately betrayed me. And I felt nothing, not anger, not even pity anymore, just a vast empty space where my loyalty used to be. I gave a small sad smile. "That's where you're wrong, Dad," I said softly. "It's not my company anymore, and therefore not my crisis." I stood up, placed a $10 bill on the table for my coffee, and walked away, leaving them sitting there stunned and silent amidst the wreckage of their own making. Con that lifted from my shoulders as I stepped out into the crisp autumn air was immeasurable. It was the feeling of liberation, profound and absolute, tinged with a quiet sorrow for the family I thought I had, the family that never truly was. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long, long time, it felt entirely my own. The collapse of Miller and Son Foods was swift and brutal. Once I'd made it clear I wouldn't be riding in on a white horse to save them, the dominoes fell quickly. Creditors called in their loans, suppliers refused to extend further credit, and the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings. The news was all over the local business pages, a cautionary tale of nepotism and mismanagement. Ethan, I heard, was in a particularly dire situation. This was where Sarah Chun, my lawyer and friend, proved invaluable once again. She'd been quietly monitoring the public filings related to Miller and Son's demise. One afternoon, she called me, a note of grim satisfaction in her voice. "Liam, you're not going to believe this, or maybe you will," she said. "It turns out our friend Ethan wasn't just incompetent. He was actively fraudulent. In a desperate attempt to make himself look good and secure more funding after you left, he'd been falsifying sales projections and taking on unsustainable short-term debt from some rather shady lenders, apparently without full disclosure even to Arthur. This was the second twist, a revelation that not only accelerated the company's implosion but also mired Ethan in a fresh set of potential legal woes. Arthur, it seemed, had been too busy propping up his chosen son's ego to scrutinize the details of his disastrous decisions. He didn't just run it into the ground, Liam, Sarah concluded. He dynamited the foundations on his way down. The public downfall of Miller & Son Foods was a painful spectacle for the community. But for me, it was a strange mix of vindication and a lingering sadness. There was no joy in their ruin, but there was a quiet affirmation that I had made the right, albeit agonizing, choice for myself. As the company went into receivership, an opportunity arose not to reclaim the tainted Miller & Son brand, but to build something new, something clean from the ashes. With Sarah's astute legal guidance, I developed a solid business plan. I wasn't interested in the Miller & Son name or its baggage of debt and deceit. Instead, I focused on acquiring specific valuable assets during the bankruptcy auction, the state-of-the-art bottling equipment I had personally selected and installed years ago, some of the original classic recipes I had refined, and crucially, the list of key supplier contacts I had cultivated through years of respectful partnership. I secured a modest business loan aided by a significant investment from Uncle David who'd quietly expressed his confidence in my abilities, and a character loan for Mr. Henderson, the elderly, respected local businessman and old family friend who sat on the board of a community bank. Mr. Henderson, I later learned, had been privately disgusted by Arthur's treatment of me and was keen to support what he called honest enterprise. I got the assets I wanted for a fraction of their original worth, leaving the shell of the old company and its mountain of debt to be picked over by creditors. I called my new venture North Star Provisions. The name felt right, a guiding light, a symbol of integrity and unwavering quality. My first calls were to Maria Rodriguez and a few other key former employees from Miller & Son, people of skill and integrity who had been sidelined or had left in disgust during Ethan's short chaotic reign. They joined me without hesitation. Maria, as my head of operations, once more was an absolute rock, her practical expertise and calm efficiency invaluable as we set up the new facility, smaller, leaner, and far more agile than the bloated old Miller & Son. We launched quietly with a focused range of high-quality locally sourced products, the industry knowledge, the supplier relationships, and the reputation for quality that I had personally built over a decade now under a new banner paid off quickly. Orders started coming in first from local gourmet shops. Then from regional distributors who remembered the quality I stood for. North Star Provisions began to thrive, not through flashy gimmicks, but through solid, honest work and a superior product, the scent of simmering fruits and spices. Once again, filled my days, but this time it was mingled with a profound sense of peace and ownership. It was the smell of my own future built on my own terms. My emotional healing was a gradual process. The anger and bitterness faded, replaced by a cautious wisdom. I learned the importance of boundaries the hard way. I found joy in my work again, a clean, uncomplicated joy free from the shadows of expectation and manipulation. What of my parents and Ethan? They lost almost everything. Their business, their standing in the community, their financial security. Arthur, stripped of his company and his pride, seemed to shrink, becoming a shadow of his former domineering self. Eleanor's social circle dwindled. Ethan, facing potential legal action from the lenders he'd defrauded, was reportedly overwhelmed and adrift. There was a final awkward encounter a year or so later at a local charity event I'd sponsored through North Star. They approached me hesitant, their faces etched with hardship. Arthur mumbled something that might have been an apology. Eleanor's eyes welled with tears. Ethan just stared at his shoes. I was polite, civil, but distant. There was no bridge left to rebuild. No desire on my part to re-enter that toxic dynamic. I wish you well, I said, and it was true in a detached sort of way, but their problems were no longer mine to solve. My definition of family had irrevocably changed. It was no longer solely about blood ties. It was about respect, trust, and genuine support. I found that with Sarah, who had been my unwavering legal and emotional anchor. I found it with Uncle David, whose quiet belief in me had been a surprising gift. And I found it with my team at North Star Provisions, a group of people bound by shared purpose and mutual respect. My family photos now included beaming faces at company picnics, shared laughter over successful product launches, not strained smiles at tense holiday dinners. Looking back, the journey was excruciating, the betrayal a wound that took a long time to scar over. But from that pain came a profound understanding of my own worth and the strength to forge my own path.